everyone. Welcome to the State Department. Okay, I'm sorry, first of all, to be not even a little late, quite late. I apologize. I can guarantee you it's not because I was sleeping off my holiday feast. But let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the State Department. I have one thing to announce at the top, and indeed it's been a question on quite a few of your minds over the past couple of days. But I can announce that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry will deliver remarks on Middle East peace tomorrow morning on Wednesday, December 28th, 2016, at the U.S. Department of State. In this speech, the Secretary will lay out a comprehensive vision for how he believes the conflict can be resolved in the Middle East. And all of his remarks, of course, will be open to the press, and this event will be live streamed at state.gov. That's all I have at the top, believe it or not, for being that late. Where are we starting? Leslie, go ahead.
Yeah. So, and where is the speech going to take place? Do you have details?
We'll get that to you. We're going to put out a notice to the press. I just wanted to simply announce this. The speech would be tomorrow morning.
And I gather he's going to talk about the UN resolution?
He will touch on that. But I don't want to, so he will touch on that, certainly, but he'll talk more broadly about, as I said, coming to the end of his term as Secretary of State. But indeed, this is an issue, Middle East peace, that he's worked on for many, many years. So he'll talk about his view, I think, on the way forward and where he sees it going.
Well, the tensions.
Where to begin, right?
Yeah.
I felt a little bit the same way.
Yeah. I mean, tensions have been increasing since the UN vote on Friday. I'm sure you've seen all the reports and heard a lot of the words. These Israeli officials are now being quoted as saying that they have evidence that they will lay out to the Trump administration in which the U.S., specifically Kerry, had discussions with the Palestinians before the vote, a few weeks before, during a visit to Washington where Saeb Erekat was around. Basically that he pushed them to go to Egypt to move ahead with this resolution. That's one of the things.
Okay.
So the question is, was the U.S. hiding behind this other group of countries to submit the resolution? Were those discussions ever taken place? Because the Israelis feel that they've got evidence that there was meddling.
Excuse me.
By the Americans.
Forgive me. Picked up a cold over the weekend, too, unfortunately, so apologize. So you're right. We've obviously seen the same reports, an amalgamation of different allegations that somehow this was U.S.-driven and pre-cooked. What I'll say, excuse me, is that we reject the notion that the United States was the driving force behind this resolution. That's just not true. The United States did not draft this resolution, nor did it put it forward. It was drafted, initially introduced, as we all know, by Egypt in coordination with the Palestinians and others. When it was clear that the Egyptians and the Palestinians would insist on bringing this resolution to a vote, and that every other country on the Council would in fact support it, we made clear to others, including those on the Security Council, that further changes were needed to make the text more balanced. And that's a standard practice with regard to resolutions at the Security Council. So there's nothing new to this. You look like you're pouncing on me, but go ahead. No, we'll continue. I can continue, but if you have do you have a follow-up?
Let's keep going with this.
And this is a really important point. We also made clear at every conversation, that the president would make the final decision, and that he would have to review the final text before making his final decision. So the idea that this was, again, pre-cooked, or that we had agreed upon the text weeks in advance is just not accurate.
But we know
And in
that
fact, go ahead, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, we know that the US didn't draft it or
Excuse me.
put it forward. But was the US in any way coaxing on another group of countries to move ahead and go and move ahead with this resolution?
Well, again, these are, again, I think it's important to have the proper context in that, all through the fall, there was talk about, and we often got the question here, and of course we replied that we're never going to discuss hypotheticals in terms of what resolutions or what is circulating out there. But of course, there has been for some time in the fall talk about this resolution or that resolution with regard to the Middle East peace and the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So of course, in the course of those conversations, we're always making clear what our parameters are, what our beliefs are, what we need to see, or in order to even consider a resolution. That's part of the give and take of the UN.
Surely these countries, before they would move ahead, would want to get the view of, an influential member of the Security Council, of the UN, of what their position would be on this.
Well, again, I think we of course, as the draft or the text was circulated, we said, to those on the Security Council that, what further changes were needed to make the text more balanced. And in fact, we ended up, abstaining because we didn't feel it was balanced enough in the sense of, it didn't hit hard enough on the incitement to violence side of the coin. Go ahead. You look perplexed. Go ahead, say.
Did you intervene to try and balance? Was it after Egypt said it was bringing it forward?
Once, I don't have a date certain. It was said once the Egyptians and Palestinians made it clear that they were going to advance this text or bring this resolution to a vote, and that, in fact, it would be supported by other countries.
Mr. Erekat visit to the State Department?
I don't know the date of his visit, but again, I'm not necessarily excluding that. When he did visit to the State Department, that they didn't discuss possible resolutions or anything like that in terms of draft language. But again, there was nothing pre-cooked. There was nothing. This was not some move orchestrated by the United States. Please.
Could you be clear what you just said? I heard a double negative in there. You're not precluding that they didn't discuss it. Are you saying that when
I don't have a
Palestinians were
readout.
here?
Yeah, I don't have a readout of that meeting in front of me. I said I can imagine that they talked about Middle East peace broadly and efforts to reinvigorate the process. I don't know that they discussed the possible action at the UN, but of course, as I said in answer to Leslie's question, that was something that was in the mix for some months now in New York at the UN, that there might be some action taken.
And what about New Zealand when the secretary was there before Antarctica? And
Yeah.
also, I believe he had a meeting here with Mr. Shukri at some point in early December. Was the resolution discussed at either of those meetings?
Again, I
with those
can't
diplomats?
specifically say whether the resolution, but certainly if a resolution or action at the UN was discussed, it wasn't discussed in the level of detail where there was some final text. We always reserved the right with any text that was put forward, drafted and put forward, to veto it or to not take action or abstain, which is what we ended up doing.
But you advised them on how to put together a motion that the United States would feel comfortable abstaining or voting in favor of.
Well, I think what we said is, and this is not just unique to this process, but once a draft text is to the point where it's going to be put forward to a vote, of course we would provide input on what we believed was language that didn't pass or didn't allow us to vote for it.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You didn't just say, bring whatever motion you like up and we'll vote however we feel about it. You were encouraging them to bring forward a motion that you would feel comfortable not blocking.
Well, but we have to be really careful in how we're talking about this, because what the allegations, no, I don't understand that, but but I'm saying that some of the allegations out there, frankly, are implying that this was somehow as I said, some orchestrated action by the U.S. To pass a resolution that was negative about settlement activity in Israel. And the fact is that that's just not the case. Of course, we would always provide, when the final text was going up for a vote, our opinion on where the red lines were. But I think that I think this is all a little bit of a sideshow, to be honest. That this was a resolution that we could not, in good conscience, veto because it condemns violence, it condemned incitement, it reiterates what has long been the overwhelming consensus, international view on settlements, and it calls for the parties to take constructive steps to advance a two-state solution on the ground. There was nothing in there that would prompt us to veto that type of resolution.
But there was
And
nothing in there
fact,
because you told them not to put anything in there
But
that would force you to veto it.
But again, but not at all. And I said we did not take the lead in drafting this resolution. That was done by the Egyptians with the Palestinians. But again, in any kind of resolution process, of course, there's moments where, it's not like our views regarding settlements or regarding resolutions with respect to Israel aren't well known and well vetted within the UN community. There's been many times in the past where we've not, or we vetoed resolutions that we found to be biased towards Israel. But, that's another point here, is that there's nothing, the other canard in all of this is that this was somehow breaking with longstanding U.S. tradition in the UN Security Council, when we all know that every administration has vetoed, or rather has abstained or voted for similar resolutions.
But it's true then you had an opportunity to ask them not to bring it forward at all and didn't take them.
I'm not sure what you're...
Well, instead of saying, why not write the motion this way, you could have said, please don't bring a motion.
Well, again, I think when it was clear to us that they were going to bring it to a vote, and that every other country in the council was going to support that resolution, that draft
It becomes
text.
clear to you that
I don't have a date certain for that. I think it was last week or so. Please.
Now, you said that everything in the resolution really is consistent with your position. And in fact, it did include language that was very strong against incitement and violence and so on. So why did you vote against it? Why would you vote?
Because-
not
yeah,
against
that's
it, why
okay.
would you abstain?
Yeah, so...
Why not vote for it?
No, it is, and I think others have spoken to this, but we believe that the resolution didn't put sufficient emphasis on the violence and incitement and terrorism that is also eroding.
What would be, in this case, what kind of language? I mean,
Well,
do
I'm
you
not
have
gonna,
anything
I'm not
specific?
gonna draft it off the top of my head, but we felt it wasn't sufficiently strong.
But you must have very clear points what these terms or these phrases would be exactly for you to vote for it, right? What are they? What are these points and phrases that would have made you vote for it?
Well, again, I think, and forgive me if I'm not specific enough, but I think our criticism in past draft resolutions has been that they are not, that they're one-sided, that they unfairly target Israel. In this case, there was language in there regarding incitement, and basically making the point that both sides need to do more in order to create a climate conducive to what we believe is the way forward, which is direct negotiations. So, it's important to remember what this resolution is and what it isn't. I mean, what it was simply a recognition that the dynamics on the ground, in particular on the Israeli side with regard to the growth, increase in settlements, the market increase in settlements, settlement activity over the past years is making the viability of a two-state solution more and more impossible. It recognized that. It also noted, as I said, the fact that the Palestinian side also is partially to blame for incitement to violence, for creating an atmosphere, again, not conducive to what we all agree needs to happen, which is direct negotiations. So this wasn't in any way an attempt to prejudge or to promote a certain outcome in that negotiation. It was simply recognizing what we believe are dangerous trends.
Let me ask you about what, seeing how this resolution lacks sanctions, it lacks any kind of, really roadmap to implement it and so on. What should the steps, in your view, I understand that this administration is departing, but in your view, what steps can be taken to ensure that the spirit and the letter of the resolution is somehow
Sure.
is implemented and translated into reality?
Well, I think that's frankly, something that Secretary Kerry will hopefully it will address and make clear in his speech tomorrow. I think he's going to kind of take that, what we need to see in terms of next steps in his speech tomorrow. This resolution, you're right, it doesn't, certainly doesn't have an impact in terms of sanctions or actions that would directly negatively affect Israel. I think what we've said is it's a call to action. It's a recognition that international opinion is noting the fact that Israeli settlement activity is an impediment to a negotiated two-state settlement. That's okay. Go, Carol, and then you, Michelle. Got time.
There's a report in an Egyptian newspaper, Sabah al-Yom, about the meeting between Secretary Kerry, Susan Rice, Saeb Erekat, and Farage, and they're reporting that Secretary Kerry and Ambassador Rice said that the United States was ready to support a balanced resolution in the Security Council, and there also was some discussion about moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and that Saeb Erekat said if that happened, that throughout the Arab world, Americans would be kicked out. Can you confirm or discuss whether this conversation in fact happened?
I apologize, I can't, Carol. I just don't know. I don't know the level of detail. I just got a roadie note here, though. Sorry. But just an update, because I was deliberately vague because I did not have a readout. But in fact, we did not discuss any language or give any indication whatsoever about a U.S. position on a settlements UNSCR in either the meeting with Erekat or in New Zealand. So that just,
Let me just take you back to Thursday, because we had
Correct the record
a great
there.
deal of discussion right after the Egyptians withdrew their draft resolution. And I asked the question at the time whether you were disappointed, because that was the impression that you're giving. So were you glad to see that these four countries have the intention, then they actually, in fact, did submit the resolution once again? Am I clear in what?
yeah, I understand what you're saying. You're asking whether we,
Yeah, well, I mean,
in essence,
were you actually, because it seemed like it's the last the last effort, or the last conceivable effort.
yeah.
I
I mean, so I don't want to attempt to characterize it. I think I'll just leave it where I thought I put it, which is that there was nothing in this resolution that we could so profoundly disagree with that it would lead us to veto it. It was, in essence, a recognition that, as I said, that, a recognition of the trends that many on the Security Council and around the world have been concerned about regarding the viability of a two-state solution. And that is, the market increase in settlement activity. I mean, you and I, Lord knows, have discussed this in great detail. And you also know that our policy, our public statements about settlements are well known. And so, there's no surprise to the reason that we chose to abstain from this vote. Please, go ahead.
So what comments, what is your reaction to the news today that Jerusalem municipality is due to consider requests for construction of new homes, of settlements today?
I mean, I saw it. We obviously saw the reports of those actions. I'll go back to what I just said, which is, we would hope that the UN Security Council resolution that was passed on Friday would serve as a wake-up call, as a call to action as an attempt to alert both sides, but certainly Israel, that its actions with regards to settlement activity are, as I said, are a detriment to moving forward with toward a two-state solution.
Has the Secretary, since the vote, spoken to anyone about that vote, or about
Anyone.
Prime Minister Netanyahu's reaction to it and his anger and his?
I apologize. What
So
you're saying?
has he
has
spoken since
with-
the vote to Prime Minister Netanyahu?
He has not. No, not since the vote. No,
Not since the vote.
no. He spoke with him last on December 22nd.
And would you say this administration is surprised by Prime Minister Netanyahu's reaction and anger and towards?
I don't know if we're,
administration?
I don't know if I'd term it surprise. I mean, certainly, they feel aggrieved. That's apparent by their reaction. But, and I would refer folks in this room who weren't there to the Secretary's remarks at the Saban Forum, where he talked in great detail and great personal experience about, the fact that, we have a relationship with Israel that is so strong and so close that sometimes we need to be able to tell them difficult things. And through our abstention on this resolution, we were conveying our concern about Israel's future. We want to see Israel succeed and prosper as a Jewish and democratic state. And we believe that if the present settlement activity is allowed to continue and intensify, that it will render the possibility of a two-state solution, which we all agree is the ultimate goal here, an impossibility. And that was part of the message that we hope was conveyed.
So the Israelis are saying, part of Prime
Yeah.
Minister Netanyahu is that you cannot have that actually this resolution makes it more difficult for peace talks to take place. That they feel that the Israelis would not be seen fairly or treated fairly in those discussions. Would you agree with that?
I wouldn't. I don't want to delve too deep into hypotheticals, but that's between the parties. This isn't something, and we've said this very clearly, that we want the UN in any way, shape, or form to decide the outcome of negotiated settlement. That's between the Palestinians and the Israeli government.
And just a last question.
go ahead,
Just a
Monica.
last question on the. Is Secretary Kerry or anyone from this administration going to the Paris talks
I don't have an answer for that.
on that?
Yeah, not.
Did you notify the Israelis ahead of time before you'd vote? And if so, can you tell us when and?
How we were going to vote?
Yes.
I'll take that question and see if I can get an answer for you.
Mark, Israel's foreign ministry has suspended all working ties with the countries that voted to pass the resolution, and it summoned the U.S. ambassador to Israel. Do you have any readout for that meeting, and what's your reaction to?
I don't have a particular readout for that meeting. Obviously, you can guess the topic. Look, I don't want to overstate Israel's reaction. I think that no one, and certainly not the United States, or the United States least of all, wants to see Israel isolated in any international forum. And so, of course, we're concerned when we see Israel take actions that we fear will further isolate it, proactive steps that will isolate it within the international community. But it's not for us to really speak anymore to what Israel decides to do. Again, we took the actions we took last week, the action we took last week, rather, in an effort to, along with the others who voted for the resolution, an effort to send a clear message about our concerns regarding settlement activity as an impediment to a negotiated peaceful settlement. No more, no less. We don't want this to create a diplomatic firestorm. In fact, just the opposite. what we want are actions that create a climate that is conducive to a return to direct negotiations. Please.
My last question on this, and how do you think this resolution will help the two-state solution?
Well, again, I spoke about the fact that, sometimes, to use a colloquial, American expression, you have to call a spade, and when we see activity or gesture, actions on the part of Israel or in Palestine, or Palestinians rather, in this case, with regard to incitement, we call it like we see it. And we've done that in this case. It is, I think, important for us to have any credibility as a neutral hand, if you will, in any negotiations, which we've offered to play going forward, and we've played in the past. You've got to be honest, and we're trying to be honest.
Mark, should we see tomorrow's speech as the last word from the Obama administration on this issue? A summary of where we are? Or is this the start of a 3.5-week push to create a new framework for negotiations?
That's a very good and very fair question. I don't want to predict anything, and nor do I have anything to announce coming up. Certainly, this administration is going to continue to work until January 20th. Morning of January 20th, important point. But I don't want to lean into it that there's going to be some kind of push behind this. I think this is, again, his Secretary Kerry sharing his vision for how we can resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Just a couple more. Ben Rhodes noted in the press conference call that this administration has been, probably the friendliest of all administrations towards Israel, noting like they most recently giving them aid to the tune of $40 billion. And so
The MOU.
Are you disappointed in the kind of rhetoric that is being thrown at this administration in its final days by the Israelis, by the Prime Minister of Israel, by others in this town who are friends of Israel, some even calling the President of the United States anti-Semitic and things like this?
Well,
How do you react to all this?
Yeah, Saeed, you have to be thick-skinned in this game we call diplomacy, as you know. So I don't want to say that we're, upset over it. But the facts speak for themselves, as you noted. No administration, no American administration has arguably done more for Israel's security. As you noted as well, just a couple months ago, we concluded a $38 billion MOU, which is the largest military assistance package in U.S. history. Worked on Iron Dome to strengthen that. We've done a lot of things, the Obama administration, to strengthen U.S.-Israeli ties, which we believe, and of course, that's on the security front, but, we also, and the Secretary of State led a very hard-fought effort to get negotiations back on track early in this second term. And of course, in the first Obama administration or term, we also had a pretty serious effort led by George Mitchell to get these negotiations back up and running. So it's not like we've, been standing idly by the side and not caring about this issue or simply giving everyone a free pass. Far from it. We have been and continue to be a staunch defender of Israel's best interests. And it's in that spirit that we feel the resolution that was passed on Friday is in that same vein.
Another Mexican question.
Another what?
Mexican question. The
Oh, thanks for
diplomacy.
16. Yeah, sure.
President Erdogan accused today the coalition of supporting ISIS. Do you have any reaction?
I think it will be late morning. I don't have a time specific. We'll put that all in the notice of press. It's a fair point. I deliberately fudged that because I don't have a certain time. I wanted to announce a speech, but I don't have it. I'm sorry. Your question was about.
President Erdogan.
Yeah, I mean it's ludicrous to be honest. No basis for truth, as you can all imagine. I don't think anyone can look at our actions on the ground leading the coalition in northern Syria, in Iraq, and say anything other than that we're 100% behind the defeat, destruction of Daesh, and even beyond Syria and Iraq, seeing its networks dismantled, destroyed around the region or outside of the region, around the world. I can give you, a rundown of what we're doing. You don't need to hear it. You know what we're doing in terms of the coalition. And in fact, we're working constructively with Turkey, to lead those efforts. And Turkey's playing a part. And we have constant dialogue and discussion with Turkey about how we can better leverage both of our efforts.
Did you contact with the Turkish officials
I don't know. You mean regarding these remarks?
regarding these remarks?
I don't know, honestly. I didn't have time to check on it. I'll see if we've
So
been in
point,
contact.
yeah, the point is Al-Bab. I mean, he's criticizing coalition for not supporting the Turkish
Yeah.
armed forces offensive in Al-Bab. I mean, do you have any reason why the coalition is not supporting Turkey in this operation?
Sorry, you're talking about El-Bab?
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm hitting the mic. I apologize. I mean, a couple things. First of all, we're obviously in close contact and discussion, dialogue, near constant with the Turks about their efforts in northern Syria. They've been very efficient, very successful. We're talking to them about how we can support them more closely. Brett McGurk is in contact with them. I don't know when he was last in Turkey, but it was fairly recently. We're aware that it's a tough fight that they're facing. That's all being still discussed. We have provided support to Turkey for operations to clear its border of ISIL, and that support's ongoing. As I said, they're now driving on El-Bab. It's a tough fight. We're talking to them about how we can help them in their efforts. I don't have anything to announce. I'd have to refer you to Department of Defense to.
Would you advise them to hold back from Al-Bab until you're ready to help them? Seems like they're getting into a tough fight.
That's their. I mean, look. That's David. That's far be it for us to, provide strategic military advice or tactical military advice to the Turks.
But you've just said you're members of the same coalition.
Well, I understand that, but I'm just saying, that we support their efforts. We have supported their efforts along the border to clear it of ISIL. We're in dialogue with them about possible next steps we can take in terms of El-Bab. I mean, we certainly won't want to see them, enter into El-Bab without sufficient support. But again, these are discussions we have on a daily basis with the Turks.
Doesn't that relate to Turkey's attacks on the U.S. ally, the YPG, in Manbij, and at that point there are all sorts of tensions developed between the United States and Turkey, and the U.S. military let it be known that Turkey had gone past what was authorized in Al-Bab, but the core of it was Turkish attacks on the U.S. ally, the YPG, fighting in northern Syria and around Manbij and other areas. Wasn't that the core of the problem?
Well, we have, you're right in that, Turkey has, and their partner forces, which is, I think, what you're referring to, have made progress in securing the border, in liberating large swaths of area, a number of towns and villages. And as I said, they're driving on El-Bab. We're mindful, of course, of some of the tensions that exist, obviously, between these Turkish supported forces and the YPD and other forces that we've been supporting in that area. And those are tensions. Again, that's the reason why we're working closely, having these discussions, and trying to coordinate with them.
You want U.S. support? You shouldn't
No,
attack
there's
U.S.
no-
allies?
no, I
No
don't-
lesson?
Look, no, I don't want to give that impression at all. Turkey's a NATO ally, a strong partner in the anti-Daesh coalition. I certainly don't want to give the impression that we're trying to send a message.
Can I press you just a little bit on?
I won't touch that.
Could I just press you on what Erdogan said I mean, he was very clear. He said U.S.-led coalition forces give support to terrorist groups, including ISIS, including YPG, PYD. They were
Well, look,
accusing
I mean,
us, wait a minute, they were
okay, so
accusing us of
let's
supporting Daesh.
let me
No,
address
he
that.
was very clear.
Let me address that. So we do provide tactical support to the Syrian Democratic Forces. There's no surprise there. We've been very transparent about that. That's to help us all achieve our shared goal of defeating Daesh. The Syrian Democratic Forces have, as we've said many times, proven to be a very capable force against Daesh, and our support for them, again, our tactical support for them will continue. As we've also said before, we've never provided weapons to the YPG, and we have provided equipment to vetted Arab elements of the Syrian Democratic Forces. This equipment has, someone's waking up, this equipment has included ammunition and other tactical equipment to assist the coalition's counter-ISIL operations. But let me be clear that we reject any group providing support to the PKK or enabling its terrorist campaign within Turkey.
Or Daesh, because he's saying that you guys gave support to Daesh.
Daesh, I said that from the outright. That's just ludicrous. I don't know where that comes from.
More questions.
Is that about Turkey?
Yes, same subject. Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
Today there are some reports that Russia indeed gave some air support around the Al-Bab. Do you have any information on that?
I don't have any information on that. I mean, I'll look into it, but, obviously the Russians and Turks have been talking about coordination, but I don't have anything to confirm.
In the past, very recent past, you defined this Turkey moves around the Al-Bab as uncoordinated and not constructive. Do you still see Al-Bab offense as uncoordinated and not constructive, or what's your view on?
No, I'd say now, we're in regular discussions with Turkey on the operations around Al-Bab. We want to help it defeat Daesh. I think there was a recent visit by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dunford, who met with Turkey's chief of staff, or chief of defense, and as I said, Special Envoy Brett McGurk, also visited Ankara before the holidays to talk about the overall campaign to defeat Daesh. So I don't want to discuss ongoing operations, but we're obviously coordinating with them.
One more talking point that on the Turkey pro-government media very often use and cited that the President-elect Trump stated that the President Obama and his administration fund ISIS and supported ISIS, so that the Turkey now repeating this. What's your response to this accusation?
I don't know where those claims are coming from. Maybe some comments from the campaign. I honestly don't know what they're referring to. I don't think President-elect Trump has ever made that allegation. And as I said, if he did, it was probably from a long time ago. I don't think he's made it again. But again, I can't speak for the President-elect's team.
The final question: Turkey, Iran, and
I
Russia are going to convene this new Syria talks in Astana, Kazakhstan,
Yes.
early 2017. Have you been invited, and
I don't believe so.
how do you view those talks?
We talked a little bit about this before when they were first announced. Look, we're not against any effort to coordinate more closely on the multiple conflicts taking place in Syria. And by multiple conflicts, I mean, obviously, destroying and disabling Daesh, but also the civil war. And of course, the terrible fighting around Aleppo over the past few weeks. As long as it produces results, we talk frequently with the Turks. We talk frequently with the Russians. We've also long said that in order to reach some kind of resolution of the conflict in Syria, all of the stakeholders need to agree and need to talk to each other. So the fact that Turkey and Russia are holding these kinds of talks is not necessarily something we would disapprove of.
But the U.S. won't be on the table. And
I understand that, but as I said, we're obviously talking closely with and communicating frequently with both Russia and with Turkey.
In this regard, Mark,
I'm sorry.
Russia's foreign ministry has said today that Minister Lavrov has discussed a peace plan for Syria with Secretary Kerry today. Do you have any readout for this phone call?
No, they did speak earlier today. I didn't get a full readout from that conversation. I'm not sure that, frankly, that they discussed Syria, so I'm not sure if it was today or
That's
a
what they
previous
said, that
conversation.
they discussed
That's what he said.
a peace plan for Syria.
Honestly, I got a very partial readout. I apologize, but I don't believe Syria was mentioned. If that's incorrect, I'll raise it, or I'll.
Was it about?
I think they talked about Libya.
Okay.
About Libya? Because the ministry also said that Lavrov informed Kerry that a U.S. decision to ease some restrictions on arming Syrian rebels may lead to more casualties. They've also said that it could open the way for the delivery of, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles.
Yeah, this is, I mean, look, this is something that was in I think the consent was, or the language was in the National Defense Authorization bill that they've been, is this what they're referring to? I believe so. Yeah. We've been
That's
very
right.
clear.
Yeah.
I mean, my point is, this is not a new allegation that we've seen from them. And, the fact is that we're not providing any kind of man pads or anything to the Syrian opposition.
And they consider this as a hostile act, as the Russian foreign ministry has said.
Right, but again, we've seen this before, this language before, or this kind of rhetoric. I mean, our position on man pads has not changed. We would have a very deep concern about that type of weaponry getting into Syria.
No, more PKK question. On the PKK, there have been repeated stories over the past months in the Iraqi and Kurdish media that Baghdad is paying the PKK in the Sinjar area to train local fighters, the Singal resistance units. Today, it's reported that Baghdad and Ankara are discussing that, and Baghdad has agreed to stop paying them and help get the PKK out of Sinjar if Turkey withdraws from Bashir. Since you've said, and KDR officials have also said, the PKK shouldn't be in Sinjar, have you pressed Baghdad to stop paying those salaries or providing any support to the PKK?
So, excuse me, I apologize. I don't want to speak necessarily to the direct allegations that they're somehow they're paying these groups. We believe that the PKK, which is a U.S. designated terrorist organization, should have no role in Sinjar. We regard their presence there as a major obstacle to reconciliation, as well as to refugee return, to the return of internally displaced people. And we urge all groups active in Sinjar to facilitate political reconciliation so that these IDPs, these internally displaced people, can return, and that the communities that they were driven from can begin to rebuild. And we urge continued close cooperation between the central government in Baghdad and the Kurdistan regional government to defeat Daesh and to resolve any other outstanding issues between them. In terms of whether Baghdad supports the PKK, I mean, that's something, it's a question you'd have to ask the government of Iraq. We believe that the government shares our concern over restoring stability in Sinjar and oppose the PKK presence there. Let's go to
Mark,
Asia. Let's
just-
finish up and
yeah,
okay,
this-
one more, and then we're going back to this patient crew back here.
Okay, thank you. About this remarks blaming U.S. for supporting ISIS. This debate
Oh, okay, sorry.
has started 2 weeks ago, if you remember. And the Turkish Foreign Ministry official talked to the Turkish press, and he said that U.S. also accused Turkey in the past for supporting ISIS, and then they gave some documentations, and it's turned out that those documentations are false, and then Secretary Kerry apologized to Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu personally.
Does this have something to do with the ISIL oil?
Oil smuggling,
Yeah.
yeah.
In fact, and again, you know, I'm an aging man who doesn't have quite the memory that he used to have, but I felt like we pretty strongly pushed back on the notion that was repeated by some journalists who aren't here today, that this was somehow some conspiracy that involved the highest levels of the Turkish government who were buying ISIL oil. And in fact, we had a senior State Department official who was very expert in energy and oil reserves and how this would work and be smuggled, come down and basically sit down with some of you in this room, I know, and basically pick that argument apart about how it would make no economic sense. And in fact, most of the oil that ISIL was able to draw from the ground was sold to third parties immediately and was kept mostly within Syria. And we were pretty adamant about pushing back against the notion that there was some, as I said, somehow that, you know, the Turkish government was aiding and abetting ISIL in selling off the oil that it was extracting from Syrian wells that it had captured. To the contrary, we said that, again, most of the oil that they pull out of the ground immediately goes into the trucks of smugglers who then oftentimes would sell it back to the Syrian government or the Syrian regime. So I don't know where that.
The thing is, this debate that the questions coming from the journalists who are trying to understand what's going on happened after the Russian jet incident at the end of 2015. But this official is referring to a conversation between the two leaders, to Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu and Secretary Kerry at the end of 2014, because Secretary Kerry gave a testimony in the U.S. Senate, and he said that ISIS is selling its oil to some neighboring countries to Syria, and one of them is Turkey. And then Çavuşoğlu asked an explanation from the Secretary Kerry regarding the Turkish press, and the Secretary Kerry gave some documentations based on these allegations. And then Turkish intelligence look at these documentations and they turn out it's something else, not an ISIS facility or oil facility, but totally different, something totally different. And then Secretary Kerry apologized for this.
Well, I'm not aware of that, that he apologized in any way, shape, or form. What I can say is that this is something that we've looked at in great detail, and I think we've said that you could never say 100% that no oil is being smuggled across the border of Syria and Turkey. Certainly not in the last several years. Certainly not in the last probably, these are, centuries-old smuggling routes that are hard to simply, shut down completely. But the allegations at the time were that this was somehow condoned or even involved the complicity of the Turkish government. And I don't think across the border we were always.
There's no apology.
I don't know. I'm unaware of one, if there was. Yeah, you sir in the middle.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask in a moment, President Obama and the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe are going to attend the event at the Arizona Memorial. So Abe said that he will not offer apology, and Japanese officials quoted him saying he believed Obama did not offer apology at Hiroshima, so it's okay for him not to apologize at Pearl Harbor. So the question is, how do the U.S. think it's appropriate and not appropriate to compare these two? And is the U.S. still expecting apology to Pearl Harbor, attack from future Japanese leader, or you actually just put an end to this part of history, as Abe said?
Well, what we've long said about these types of or these events that took place is that since the end of World War II, the U.S. and Japan have forged a very strong alliance and partnership that has frankly brought a measure of peace, stability, and prosperity to the Pacific region that's never been known before. We have built out of the ashes of that terrible conflict a stronger U.S. and Japan relationship, and it's in that spirit that whether it was the president's visit to Hiroshima or whether it's Prime Minister Abe's visit today to the site of the Pearl Harbor and the site of the Arizona, USS Arizona, that we do so in a spirit of looking forward with a mind on what happened, certainly. We remember what happened, but we want to look forward in this relationship, and we want to build on this relationship. We want to make it stronger, partly out of, frankly, out of the memory of those who died in that conflict.
But do you think the past has been settled? Obviously, a year ago, 200 Western historians, many Americans, including like Ezra Vogel from Harvard, asked the Japanese Prime Minister Abe to face squarely about history, especially the atrocities in Asia. I mean, so this obviously, and the Chinese Foreign Minister spokesman also said, if Japan does not have a peaceful, peace reconciliation with China and other victimized country in Asia, Japan can never leave this part of history behind. So what's your thought of that?
Well, again,
are
we
we
always,
putting a period on that or
I
not?
mean, we always call for, and it's not with just respect to Japan, but any country, that we always call for an historical accounting of past events. Is always important to moving beyond those events. But look, again, I think the strength of the U.S.-Japanese relationship speaks for itself. We are honored to have the Prime Minister visit the site of Pearl Harbor, and I'll leave it there. Please. Yep.
China has sent their first aircraft carrier toward to the South China Sea first time for Chinese. Are you aware of it? Do you have any comment on that?
We are aware this China's, as you said, first aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific. I don't have any particular comment. As we often say, we recognize the rights of and freedoms and lawful uses of the sea and airspace guaranteed to all countries in accordance with international law. As former Admiral Kirby will say, whales and icebergs, or not just for, what's his thing? Not just for whales and icebergs? Anyway, sorry, I'm blowing it. Not just for freedom of navigation is not, thanks, man.
But this
Freedom, I want to say for the record, freedom of navigation is not just for whales and icebergs. Otherwise, I'll have an email from him later.
okay, and this operation is close to the Japan and then Taiwan. Is it good timing for operation for the freedom of navigation from your perspective? Do you have any concern for the peace and stability in the region?
Well, look, again, I don't understand. I don't believe that this was in international waters. And again, as we often make the case with our own naval vessels sailing, in all seriousness, sailing in those same waters, that it's freedom of navigation. That if they are in international waters, they have the right to sail there. And so if it holds true for the United States, it should hold true for China. It should hold true for other countries as well. Is that it? Last question.
2017 National Authorization Act, actually, highlight U.S. military exchange with Taiwan. Could you shed some light why this is so this time, given, the timing is that there is more tension between the mainland across strait and Taiwan?
Excuse me. I'm not sure. What was the first part of your question?
So obviously the National Defense Authorization Act this year for 2017 highlights the military exchanges between Taiwan and the U.S. So why you think, this is a highlight this time given the tension across the strait?
Well, I don't know that there's we're not seeking to highlight tensions and cross-strait tensions. Our policy with regard to Taiwan is exactly the same, hasn't changed. We believe in one China policy. There's been no change to that policy. I don't have any particular details to add to your question, though, except that we obviously have a strong security relationship with Taiwan.
Mark, can I just have a last question?
Of course.
I just go back to the Secretary Kerry's speech tomorrow. What does he hope to achieve through this speech? Is it just things that he's felt he hasn't had time to say, or I mean, is he hoping that it would be picked up and taken forward into a Trump administration?
Well, I
which
think
is
that's
unlikely?
always, I mean, that's always the hope. I think, look, I think, he feels it's his duty in his waning weeks and days as Secretary of State to lay out what he believes is a way towards a peaceful two-state solution in the Middle East. As we've said about other proposals, it's always important to try to keep the process moving forward, to lay out constructive visions for the future, but also to underscore the fact that we haven't given up on this, and we don't want the Palestinians or the Israelis to give up on this either.
And Mark, last one. Can you take this apology question? I mean,
Yeah,
can you clarify?
Sure. I'll get back to you if we have anything to say about it. Your last one on South Sudan.
So the other resolution last week was the arms embargo on
Yep.
South Sudan
Yep.
at the UN.
Yep.
I'm wondering if you could give some insight as to why the U.S. wasn't able to convince any other Security Council members to vote in favor of it, especially Japan, which has peacekeeping operations there. And I guess more broadly, how does that vote reflect on the international community and the Security Council as a whole?
Sure. Well, we did strongly support a Security Council resolution to impose an arms embargo on South Sudan, as well as additional targeted sanctions on those who have engaged in actions or policies that threaten the peace, security, and stability of South Sudan. Obviously, there's very credible reports, growing violence, refugee outflows in South Sudan, and I think just rising concern over the situation there. I think that, unfortunately, certain members of the council made the decision to protect some of the parties to the conflict and send the message that they support the status quo in South Sudan. What we don't want is that the results of this vote be misinterpreted by the perpetrators of violence in South Sudan. We're going to continue, we, the United States, to be watching their actions closely. We'll continue to work and demand their accountability. We're going to work to stop the flow of weapons, and we're going to work to help prevent violence against civilians there. Thanks, guys.